denying Christ's role in making me an apostle. You're ignoring the Holy Spirit's role in uh, giving us that seal of the knowledge of Jesus Christ, and uh, basically you're making wild accusations you ought not make. Is really the implication here. Paul goes on then, in the last two verses of this chapter, he says, he explains to them why he didn't come. He gives them the full explanation. He says, but I call God as witness to my soul, that to spare you I did not come again to Corinth. Not that we lord it over your faith, but we are workers with you for your joy, and in your faith you are standing firm. So he gives them the explanation. Why didn't I come to you? I'll tell you why I didn't come to you. I didn't come to you because, first of all, I wanted to give you time to put things in order. He had written, of course, that letter of First Corinthians that we have, and didn't want to have to scold you again. He had made, we will see, he had made a trip back to Corinth. Apparently, that trip was not a happy one, and so he said, "I didn't want to come again. I wanted to kind of give you some time." And he said, he said, "I did it to spare you. I didn't want to. I didn't want to feel like you were just getting beat up by me. Want to give them some time to put some things in order, to repent, to make whatever correction is needed." As he wrote in Hebrews 12 and verse 11, he says, "No discipline is pleasant." Let me read that, right? Or I'll garble the quote. 12 and verse 11. There he says, "All discipline for the moment seems to be not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness." So he recognized the value of discipline, even though at the time discipline's not pleasant. And for these Corinthians, apparently that discipline was unpleasant. When Paul had visited them at that second time, it was unpleasant. And he said, I wanted to spare you. I didn't want to come, keep showing up and having to deal with these same things over and over again, with you not having had time to make whatever correction was needed to be made. He also says, I didn't want to appear to be lording it over you. If Paul comes in, why the men who could handle the men, the brethren, the Christians who ought to be handling the problem are going to they're going to tend to take a back seat. Here's Paul, we'll let Paul deal with it. And Paul says, I don't want to be in charge. I don't want to be in charge of this. You're in charge of this. And he says here, not that we would lord it over your faith, but as workers with you for your joy. He says, I'll work with you, but I don't want to be in charge of this. This is not my situation, but yours. And you need to take care of this situation. We see that same kind of attitude out of 1 Peter 5 and verses 2 and 3. Peter there is writing to the elders, starting back in verse 1, therefore exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising its oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness. Nor yet as lording it over those who are allotted to your charge, proving to be examples of the flock. Here was that concept here that both Paul and Peter are teaching. We don't want to be lords over you. One Christian is not the Lord over another Christian. Unfortunately, we got various religious groups that have that hierarchy. They want to set up that hierarchical status. No, says Paul, we're not. He's not going to establish that kind of hierarchy, and he denies it, and so does Peter. It is the idea that this is, again, your situation. You need to address this. You need to be handling this. And I'm not going to inject myself any more than just sort of is absolutely necessary to help correct the situation. Now, we go now into chapter 2. Chapter 2 is really these two verses, verses 23 and 24 at the end of chapter 1, really tie up with chapter 2 and verse 1, and even the first 4 verses of chapter 2. So we see that continuity. This is really a continuity of thought here, and not really a true, not really wasn't a good place to break the chapter. It would have been better to break the chapter maybe after verse 22, and put 23 and 24 with verse 1 of chapter 2. But if we go on then and see what Paul says here, it's a continuation of the thought. He says, "But I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again." Again, you see the continuity of the thought. I came to you, as he says here at the end of at the end of chapter 1, I came to spare you. I wanted to spare you. I didn't want to come. I didn't determine. He says for my own sake, I didn't want to come to you in sorrow again. I didn't want to go through that apparently emotional turmoil. I didn't want to go through that emotional distress that had been caused, and so I'm backing off. Basically, I'm backing off the situation. Paul apparently had made a trip to Corinth, a second trip at some point to Corinth, about which we know nearly nothing other than just what little snippets we find here in this letter. It was apparently, again, a disappointing trip. It was a sad trip, perhaps frustrating trip. We know of this second trip because he indicates that he has plans for a third trip later in the letter. In chapters 12 and verse 14, and in chapter 13, verse 1, he mentions making a third trip. And so, obviously, there would have had to have been a second trip at some point. And that is what he's referencing here. He says, I would not come to you in sorrow again, for if I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one to whom I made sorrowful? He wants to give these folks that he's been dealing with here. He wants to give them time and space. Sometimes, what we do see here is a fair amount of the wisdom of Paul. That every situation that we're going to encounter with brethren can't necessarily be addressed by charging in full bore with guns blazing and having some strong personality take control and force a decision on a bunch of people. Yes, Paul could have done that. Paul could have come there, forced a decision, and put things in some degree of order in that way. But sort of theory, management theory, tells us that there are sort of 4 ways of dealing with conflict. There's withdrawal, there is smoothing, there is forcing, and there's collaboration. Okay, if I can remember them from memory. There's a ready recollection. Withdrawal is simply, we're just going to ignore the problem. We'll just pretend the problem doesn't exist, and we'll step away from it. Smoothing is, we'll arrive at some compromise. Half a loaf is better than none, and so we'll end up in a situation where you get maybe part of what you want, but not all, and I get part of what I want, but not all, and so we arrive at some sort of conciliatory compromise that will work. Forcing is when the one who has greater authority comes in and says, all right, we're going to do it this way. It's going to be this way or the highway. Um, and you've undoubtedly encountered that kind of attitude before, where yes, we're going to do it my way because I've got the superior authority, I've got the superior position, and that's why we're going to do it that way. And of course, and then the fourth way is this collaboration way, which is to say, let's sit down, let's look at the problem, let's examine what kinds of alternatives we have, and can we perhaps think outside the box, as it is said. Can we look at a way to do this in such a way that gives us all what we want, achieves the goal, achieves the ultimate objective we want? Maybe we even find a different way of doing it, or a different approach. But in the end, we end up with that collaborative means. And so here is in Paul, in this example, I think Paul is giving them sort of a little bit of time and a little bit of space with him not present, so that they can work it out, that they can deal with it as they are supposed to. And I think that's what the intention was here. He says, the same ones who made me sad are the same ones who can gladden me. And how does Paul expect them to be gladdened? Paul expects to be gladdened by finding out that, yes, we've effectively dealt with the situation. We've effectively dealt with it and resolved it. And that's sort of what he does say. He goes on then in verses 3 and 4, this is the very thing I wrote to you, so that when I came, I would not have to sorrow with those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you all, that my joy would be the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not so that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you. Now, again, we got various points of view especially on this section here. There are some Bible scholars, some commentators who look at this, and they have suggested that there was some intermediate letter written between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians that Paul was writing, that was a very sternly worded, very strong letter on his part, scolding them pretty severely. Others have suggested, no, there's no evidence of an intermediate letter, but rather this would be a reference to what he wrote in 1 Corinthians. If you remember what he was dealing with there in 1 Corinthians, this could have been that letter that he talks about when he said that he writes in sorrow, and out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears. Does that fit with the narrative of 1 Corinthians? And the answer is yes, it does. If you consider the subject matter of various sections of 1 Corinthians, we know that he was dealing with the factionalism and the disputes and the divisions that were going on in the church. We know that he addressed the man who was in an incestuous relationship. We know that he was writing in 1 Corinthians. We recall that he was writing in 1 Corinthians about their use and misuse of the Lord's Supper and the drunkenness and the excesses that they were engaged in. We also know of the argument, the issue that he was having with them, with some of them denying even the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so we can imagine even that letter would have been written with sorrow, with much tears, and that there was not necessarily a need for an intermediate letter. So again, there's two schools of thought. I'm tending to lean in favor myself that there was no intermediate letter, that Paul here is referencing the letter we know as 1 Corinthians when he writes this, and of the events that were going on there. And you can imagine when he wrote that letter in 1 Corinthians, how he would have been concerned about that church, making note of all these things that were going on there, of the various sins and the various shortcomings that they were having at that church. again, as he says here, he wants to, he comes back to them though, and with this idea that you might know the love which I have especially for you. He was apparently very fond of this church. He was very fond of this church, of the members of this church, and had been very concerned about it. And we will find something of his relief at learning that this church has successfully dealt with some of the situation, um, and made some correction according to what he had instructed them. He goes on in verse 5, for if any has caused sorrow, he has caused sorrow not to me, but in some degree, in order not to say too much, to all of you. Sufficient for such a one is this punishment which was inflicted by the majority, so that on the contrary, you should rather forgive and comfort him. Otherwise, such a one might be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. Most of the commentators who look at that passage suggest or indicate that the reference here, the one who had caused the pain, was this incestuous man who's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5. That man, you recall, who had his father's wife, had married his stepmother, or at least was living with his stepmother. That was, now there are a few commentators, by the way, there are a few commentators that want to argue that no, there was some other fellow that had caused this situation, someone who was perhaps being argumentative with Paul. Most of that opinion is based on the writings of an early Christian writer named Tertullian, who wrote about this situation. But if we look at what Tertullian wrote, Tertullian would have written roughly maybe 100 years or so after this situation, and even Tertullian gives no detail, he gives no documentation, he gives no evidence other than basically just a formed opinion that what's being discussed here is a situation different from that of 1 Corinthians 5. So you either put a great deal of faith on Tertullian or you don't. And frankly, most of the commentators don't put a great deal of faith on Tertullian. They do think that this is a reference to those events in 1 Corinthians 5. Paul points out here that this, he says, he has caused sorrow not to me, he says, but to some degree, in order not to say too much, to all of you. We should understand that to be, he didn't cause pain to me only, okay? Not that this fellow had caused no pain at all to Paul. Yes, Paul had been, as he says, writing in tears, so we understand that Paul was having pain, but Paul also said, no, the greater pain is your pain. Well, why? The greater pain, and he was doing something that was not even spoken of among the Gentiles. And yet here was this man, and we've seen it in our own time, where a member of a church will do something in a public way, in a disgraceful way, in such a way that that person becomes a prominent face on the news broadcast, and not in a good way. I can't help but recall a situation a few years ago where a fellow who was an elder of a church, not a Church of Christ, but a different denominational elder, was found accused of and apparently guilty of child molestation. And what kind of reputation do you think that puts on the church? Oh, you're a member of the church where they had the child molester. Oh, that's a great moniker, isn't it? We all want to be known as members of the church that have the child molester. This was a disgrace to this church. This was an embarrassment. This would have been a subject of gossip and scandal, and it would have smeared, painted with the same brush, if you will, all of the members of that church. They would have all been painted with that kind of uh, scandal, with that kind of disgrace, with that kind of embarrassment over having this fellow being a member of your church, where you're in church with the incestuous guy. What kind of a great thing is that? Paul said, though, goes on to, huh? Yeah, yeah, it's 5. 6 is where he talks about taking. Yeah, it's First Corinthians 6 where he talks about taking you're taking one another to lawsuits. Yeah. Well, yeah, it would have been nearly impossible to keep in the church. What with this fellow, yeah, living with his father's wife, or he's moved in with his mother, his stepmother, and yeah, it would have been a scandal. It would have been a gossip. Uh, I can imagine it would have been a real gossip treat for those who want to engage in gossip. Um, and of course, it would have in turn cast aspersion on any member of the church, any member of that same congregation. Oh, you guys must be some real freewheeling folks if you're going to allow this sort of thing to go on in your congregation and not take any action on it. Yeah, right. Well, and that's why Paul scolds them in First Corinthians. Here was a situation that demanded immediate action. It demanded some kind of an immediate action, and they were kind of sitting on their hands. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah, if I'm missing the point, by all means. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, it was just a scandal. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. I can imagine so. Mhm. Right. Good point. Right. Yeah. 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 It may not be. Yeah, as John points out, it may not. There may be something going on that may not be illegal, but it might be immoral. It might be reprehensible, regardless, even if it's not illegal. And and yeah. 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 Yeah, I don't know. That's a good, yeah, a good point. Uh, the uh, yeah, we've seen. I had an, gosh, I had a thought and it just ran away from me. It's all right. No, it's not your fault. It just, yeah, yeah. I had a thought, then your dad made his comment, and it just vanished like a vapor. But anyway, uh, well, yeah, that was his point all along. This was something you should have dealt with and dealt with immediately, and you let this thing drag out. It and I oh yeah, here was my thought. That was I wonder if the lawsuits that he was mentioning in chapter 6 might have been associated in some way with the situation here we signed in chapter 5. That here were members who uh, were engaged in scandalous behavior, and rather than deal with it in the church, they decided to start filing lawsuits about it in some way. Um, it would seem to me to be a remarkably silly thing to do, but I've heard of, I guess, some fairly silly things over time of people have done. So that wouldn't surprise me. But we can imagine, a brother who is engaged in some sort of immoral, scandalous behavior, um, not illegal, and instead of taking it to the church and trying to correct the situation through the church, why we're going to file a lawsuit against the guy. Um, really? You think that's the solution here? That I think that's uh, what Paul's astonishment was as we read there in 1 Corinthians 6. Paul goes on then to say here, he says in verse 6, sufficient to the he says sufficient for such a one is his punishment which was inflicted by the majority. Uh, Paul Paul says, okay, you disciplined this fellow. The discipline was effective and it was sufficient. You're done now. There is some suggestion here by some of the commentators that there were those in the church who wanted to extend extend the punishment. We've taken disciplinary action. Let's throw the rascal out. Let's be done with him altogether. Is the sort of the sense here? And Paul says, no, that's not how this works. You don't, you're not going to try and, beat this man, sort of metaphorically beat him to death. Um, you want to discipline him, but you don't want to discipline him to the point that, as he says here, on the contrary, you should rather forgive and comfort him. Otherwise, a one might be sorrow, and that overwhelmed is the word that means swallowed up. He might be, you're basically allowing him to be eaten alive with his sorrow. Yes, he's recognized the sin of what he's done. He's recognized what disgrace he's brought to the church. He's repented. He's penitent. Um, it's time to close, is what really I think Paul is saying here. It's time to kind of close this. Let's forgive. Let's be comforted. Let's let this man be comforted, and it's time to close this. He says here in verse. He goes on to say in verse uh, uh, 8, wherefore I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. it's time to bring this to a close. You've disciplined him. He's accepted the discipline. He's made correction, and you need to reestablish a loving relationship with him. He says, verse 9, for to this end also I wrote, so that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things. But one whom you forgive anything, I forgive also. For indeed what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, I did it for your sakes in the presence of Christ, so that no advantage will be taken of us by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his schemes. He says, I wrote this, I did this as basically a test. This was a test to you. And again, this is probably a reference back to what he wrote there in 1 Corinthians. I wrote that as a test to you to see if you were going to be obedient. Were you going to man up, and were you going to be acting like Christians, or were you going to abandon? And the answer, and he's pleased to see, no, you stepped up and you did what was right. You did the right thing. And so, for that, he's grateful. There's a certain tactfulness on the part of Paul here as he writes, because you notice he specifies neither the sinner nor the sin involved here. There is that sense that no, we're not going to keep rubbing our noses in this. We're going to deal with it in a tactful way. The discipline has been successful. The situation's resolved. It's time to be forgiving, time to be loving, time to restore that person and reaffirm the bonds of love. And suggests here, Paul does, that there's nothing more unbecoming to a church than to withhold forgiveness to a member who is repentant and who is asking for forgiveness. That becomes a stain on the church, that they would be so arrogant, so unforgiving as to refuse to accept this member back. Paul says here, as we see here at the end of this section, he says, Paul adds his own forgiveness to this. He says, if you forgave him, I forgave him. He says, I forgive also, for indeed I have forgiven. If I have forgiven anything, I did it for your sakes in the presence of Christ. In other words, I did it for your sake, so that you'd understand, yes, it was time for forgiveness. It was time for you to understand that it was needful to forgive this man. He says, I also want to give no advantage be taken of us by Satan. This idea of no advantage is this advantage. Right. Yeah, there is that sense of loving forgiveness for this one who is repentant. Paul says he wants to give no advantage to Satan. This is that no advantage phrasing there is it carries with it the connotation of we don't want you to be defrauded by Satan, and it's the language suggests one who would steal by means of some cunning deception. We know about these fraudsters by fraud. We know about these fraudsters who in my line of work, we're reading about them all the time. These cyber criminals who will get on the computers, and they will try to send you some enticing email or some other computer linkage of some sort, and with the idea of trying to either get you to click on a link and thereby gain access to your banking system, or to otherwise entice you to send them money in some way or another. Some Nigerian prince who has come into millions of dollars and needs your bank account to help him clear it out. Yeah, we've all heard of that. That's the idea here. That's the idea here is that Satan is seeking to defraud you in that way. By what means? What do we mean here, Paul? Well, what Paul means here is, by you maintaining this wall of separation between you and this penitent man, you're displaying that arrogance, and you're allowing yourself to be thought of, thinking yourself of as being perhaps better than you are. Well, at least I wasn't with my stepmother. That kind of an attitude, and it carries with it the idea that by doing so, you're allowing Satan to have inroads into you to potentially steal your salvation away, to steal your soul. And Paul says, don't give him that avenue. Don't give him that opportunity. We're not, he says, we're not ignorant of his approach. We're not ignorant of how he runs things. Just as we've kind of figured out that, yeah, that Nigerian guy doesn't have millions of dollars sitting around that he can't move, or he doesn't have, tons of gold hidden somewhere that he needs your help redistributing. All right, I'm going to cover at least these next two verses 12 and 13. He says, now this is kind of a shift in view. He says, now when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, and when the door was opened for me in the Lord, I had no rest for my spirit, not finding Titus my brother, but taking my leave of them, I went on to Macedonia. And so again, here's Paul returning to his topic of explaining, here's what happened. Here's why I wasn't able to come to you. He says, I went to Troas. He says, I went to Troas. Well, why? Well, we know why. There was this riot in Ephesus. We read about it over in the book of Acts. There was this riot. Paul had gone to Troas with the intent of ultimately going from Troas into Macedonia, but he was hoping to find Titus there. Apparently there had been some agreement between them that Titus would try to catch up with him in Troas. Titus is an interesting fellow. I'm not sure that I remember hearing a lot of sermons about Titus, but he's a fairly interesting fellow from the point of view of Paul. And it tells us something about Paul. It tells us something about Titus. Paul, of course, you remember, was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And here he is, though, describing this man, Titus, who was a Gentile, as one of his dearest friends. This would have been an astounding development for a man like Paul to have had this close friend in Titus. Paul, of course, had taken Titus with him to Jerusalem and had defended him there against Judaizing teachers who were insisting that Titus had to be circumcised. We find that over in Galatians 2 and verse 3. We know that Paul had sent him to Corinth to assist the church there. We'll read that later in this letter in chapters. He is described as Paul's fellow partner and fellow worker, his partner, in chapter 8 and verse 23. We find that in the book of Titus, in the letter to Titus, in chapter 1 and verse 4, Paul describes him as my true child, according to the common faith. Paul had a great affection for this man and had hoped to see him again at Nicopolis, as he writes there in Titus 3 and verse 12. And as Paul, at the end of his life, there writing the letter of 2 Timothy, was facing certain death, and yet his thoughts turned to Titus once again, was thinking of him in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10. as one that he longed to see again. And so here is this man Titus that Paul is anxious to see and does come and delivers to him good news from the church at Corinth. All right, I'll stop there. We'll pick up the last part of this chapter then next week, and hopefully, Lord willing, we'll go into chapter 3. Thank you for your attention and comments this morning. That is in the college press conference. Look at this. At least this will work. Most of the time. You know, there in First Corinthians, you skipped over a lot. No, I never did. There,